Today I'm honored to host my colleague, Wendy Z. Goldman and Donald Filtzer, authors of the new book, Forest, Dark and Stern, The Soviet Home Front During World War II, published with Oxford University Press in 2021. And with us today, we're also pleased to have Edward Serotta, founder and director of the Centropa Jewish Historical Institute and Oral History and Photography Archive, will be interviewing Wendy and Donald about their new book. After the discussion, we'll have time for some Q&A. And what you can do is send me, Michal Friedman, your questions through the chat at any time during the discussion. But the general chat will be closed. But first, a few words about our distinguished speakers. Wendy Z. Goldman is the Paul Mellon Distinguished Professor of History at Carnegie Mellon University. Her early work focused on family, policy, women, and industrialization in the Soviet Union. She wrote about Stalinist repression in Terror and Democracy in the Age of Stalin, The Social Dynamics of Repression, published in 2007, and Inventing the Enemy, Denunciation and Terror in Stalin's Russia in 2011. And more recently, she focused on World War II and Hunger and War, Food Provisioning in the Soviet Union during World War II, published in 2015, and also co-edited with Donald Filtzer, one of our other guests today. Her books and articles have been translated into Russian, Czech, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, and Japanese. Donald Filtzer is Emeritus Professor of Russian History at the University of East London in the United Kingdom. He's a labor historian and has authored a series of monographs on the history of Soviet workers during the Stalin, Khrushchev, and Gorbachev periods. I'll be selective, but among his more recent works are Soviet Workers and Late Stalinism, Labor, and the Restoration of the Stalinist System After World War II, published in 2002, and The Hazards of Urban Life in Late Stalinist Russia, Health, Hygiene, and Living Standards between 1943 and 1953, published in 2010, and the latter two have been translated into Russian. He's currently preparing a revised edition of Soviet Workers and Stalinist Industrialization, hopefully to be followed by a final monograph, Health, Disease, and Mortality on the Soviet Home Front During World War II. Edward Serotta, third guest, is a writer, photographer, and filmmaker who since 1985 has specialized in Jewish subjects in Central and Eastern Europe. He has published 4 books on the subject and produced 4 documentary films for ABC News, Nightline. As a journalist, he covered the revolutions of 1989 and the Bosnian War between 1993 and 1995. In 2000, he founded Centropa, a Jewish historical institute that combines oral histories with old family photographs. The main reason I brought Ed Serotta together with Wendy and Don today is because among its many other merits, Forest, Dark and Stern is the first scholarly history to draw so extensively on the Centropa archive oral history interviews. The book is thus a perfect example of how scholars can make use of the incredibly rich and invaluable oral history interviews of the Centropa archive, an archive which covers Jewish lives across the 20th century, from Turkey to Greece, the Balkans to Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. Before I pass the mic to Ed Serotta, I would like to give everyone a very brief overview of Forest, Dark and Stern. The book is notably the first archivally based comprehensive history of the Soviet home front during World War II and of the civilians who played a critical role in the global victory over fascism, a story which remains little known to this day in the West, not in small part due to the ensuing Cold War. After Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, German troops seized the heartland of the Soviet industry and agriculture and turned the occupied territories into mass killing fields. The Red Army, overpowered by the Blitzkrieg, fell back in disarray. Yet in contrast to the initial military disaster, the book demonstrates that the state's policies on the home front were far more effective. And Fortress, Dark and Stern chronicles this epic story: the evacuation of industry, the rationing of a dwindling food supply, public health and epidemics, and the civilian labor draft. Focusing on the impact of total war, it examines the efforts of ordinary people who withstood starvation and horrific conditions to provision the front and make the Allied victory possible. It tells the stories of evacuees, refugees, teenage and women workers, runaways from work, prisoners, and deportees. And the home front developed is the book demonstrates the home front developed in tandem with the military front, shaped by the often unpredictable and fast-moving exigencies of territorial loss and liberation. The chapters are built around the defining policies of the wartime state, which were evacuation, resettlement, rationing, labor mobilization, public health, and propaganda, and the popular responses that supported, limited, and reshaped these policies. The book thus takes both the Soviet state and its population, including refugees and evacuees, and their interaction as mutual protagonists in the story, beginning with the frenetic efforts to evacuate and resettle people and industry, as well as livestock, and ending with the initial attempt to incorporate the newly liberated territories. And among some of the major questions the book addresses are, what were the state policies that enabled the country to win the war, and what conditions did these policies create? How did people respond and why? And really, how did the Soviet state manage to mobilize its population on such a massive scale and under extremely harsh conditions, including under direct Nazi bombardment, conditions of food scarcity and hunger, and yet win the war? Where was the population driven by an identification with a socialist project, by anti-fascism, or might these two driving forces have been too closely intertwined to parse them? Or were there other factors involved? And to what degree, what was the degree of resistance? And of course, as a historian of Jewish history, the question of the categories of evacuation in which Jews were not identified as a category, yet over 1 million Jews were evacuated, but others were not, is also part of this story, which is quite interesting and which the book addresses. And just to remind you again, before I hand it over to Ed, that we will have time for Q&A at the end, so you can send me at any point during the discussion, Michal Friedman, your questions, and I encourage you to do so. Thank you. Ed.
Thanks very much, Michal. And it's very much a pleasure for me to be here. Greetings to everyone from Vienna. And a few years ago, there was a woman who wrote a book called The Possessed, Elif Batuman. And she wrote a book about being obsessed with Russian novels, late 19th century novels. And she wrote a book about the people who were obsessed with them. And I am kind of obsessed that way with the Soviet Union and the Second World War. I have been fascinated and gobbled up every single book on the military history of the Second World War that I could find, because it's about as big a scale as you can possibly get. What this book did was fill a gap that I hadn't even thought of, but of course has been looming just out of my field of vision. And the deficit that Fortress Dark and Stern really fills is one of how the Soviet authorities actually managed to evacuate so many people, and how they got so much of its infrastructure out of harm's way. And then in this book, Wendy and Donald, what you do is that you tell us about how they relaunched that and rebuilt that infrastructure as best they could. And so therefore, it's good to go into this with you. And my first question is to both of you, when did you notice this deficit about the Soviet home front during the war? And with so many archives now closed in Russia, how did you do your research? And I'm not only speaking about using the Centropa archive, of course.
Well, I can start with that. Let me just say that, first of all, anybody who has spent any time in the former Soviet Union and has spent any time in Russia at all as anything but a brief tourist is aware of the enormous impact of World War II. I can remember when I first began doing research in the Soviet Union in 1984, and Don probably goes back even earlier than that. There were still seats for war veterans, for invalids on the metro. And the lack of men, this eerie lack of men of a certain age, and yet the presence of women, very powerful, strong women of that same age within just social life was really outstanding. So the war was everywhere. It was in every family. And that's lasted, I would say, to this day still. It has really had an enormous impact on the country. So Don and I are both very interested in social history, and it became clear after the archives opened with the fall of the Soviet Union that it was possible to do all kinds of research on the social history of the country. There were a few books that were written on the home front, but none of them had made use of the archives because the archives in the Soviet period, of course, had not been fully open to research in freely. But starting in about the 1990s up to the present, I can't speak for the pandemic year, the archives have been open, and it's possible to do wonderful, amazing research. And Don and I began this project, I would say about 10 years ago. We began researching. We were there almost every year, sometimes more often than once a year, in all weathers and all climates. And we were able to do just remarkable work in the archives, in a number of different archives. So the archives are not closed. Again, I can't speak for the pandemic, but we found remarkable material there.
Well, that's the way that we hear so much about things closing up in Russia. That's a pleasure to hear. The same for you, though, Donald. You've written several books on the Khrushchev era and labor during the Stalin years, but this seems to be a very different model of labor, of what was happening, to say the least. Can you tell me how you were able to piece together the various aspects of this story about how labor was actually reconstructed and in the stands, as they say, in Central Asia and all that?
Well, this was very much a joint enterprise because we were working in different, Wendy and I were working in different archives, looking at different topics and different aspects of the home front. I got into this project really because, as you just said, I'm a labor historian, and the big gap in the that I hadn't covered really was the war period. In many ways, what I found in the course of our research was a lot of aspects of regarding the lives and the work process of Soviet labor was rather different from what I thought I might find. Having studied the 1930s and late Stalinism and the Khrushchev and Gorbachev periods. The situation inside the factories was significantly different. There was much tighter discipline, much tighter managerial control. On the other hand, there was much more consensus on the part of the workforce to cooperate with the authorities and to join in with the war effort. A lot of the work that I've done is focused on processes of informal bargaining inside factories, which is a phenomenon well known also in Western industry. And you see a lot of this, what you don't see in the war period is you don't see that this is a very prominent aspect of factory life. People are getting on despite the, as we'll talk about, I think, the enormous hardships of the war years are getting on with the work of actually producing what they need to produce.
Thanks for that. Now, so we know that June 22nd, 80 years ago today, is when 3.5 million or whatever the number of German soldiers plus their allies, the Hungarians, Romanians, and the Finns, streamed across the border. And within just a couple of days, and this is what I learned from the book in one of the first chapters, is arranging the evacuation, and Soviet authorities actually sprung into action and began organizing all of this. Can you tell us just who began organizing the evacuation of industry and how much of it actually was rescued? I'm sure, Donald, this is relevant to your research since Stalin had embarked on this massive industrialization program in the 1930s. So that must have been something for you. But so I'd like you both to say something about that.
Wendy, why don't you go first, because you studied their work at the archives of the evacuation committee.
Well, this goes back to, I guess, the first question you had, Ed, about archives. The Soviet for Evacuation, which was created 2 days after the invasion, has this enormous fund of material in the Russian state archives. And I think it's such a large fund of material that it's unlikely, in fact, that any one person could get through it in a lifetime. I mean, it is just astounding how much stuff is there. But this organization, this Soviet or council, was created within 2 days of the invasion, and it was responsible for trying to get people and industry and agriculture, if possible, out of harm's way. Now, initially, its remit was fairly narrow, because you have to remember, no one had any idea what was going to happen. No one had any idea how far the Red Army was going to retreat, and no one knew how much territory was going to be lost. So on June 22nd, 1941, this Soviet was created 2 days later, but it still wasn't clear how much was going to be lost. So initially, what the Soviet did was it began just trying to get mostly people out of harm's way, to work as fast as it could. It was responding to crisis. It was responding to threat, areas that might be bombed and areas that were in danger of being overrun by the Germans. By August, however, so that was within, I would say, about less than 2 months, about 6 weeks of the invasion, the government had made quite a remarkable decision. And that was that it was going to reconfigure the entire economy by moving the industrial base from west to east. Now, the state had a lot of experience with planning and with a planned economy. So it was that experience in the 1930s that really allowed it to even think like this. I mean, when you think about this, it's an absolutely audacious idea. This idea that you will just pick up an entire economic base, because most of the industrial base was actually concentrated in the West, and you will just move it from west to east in the middle of an enormous invasion in which the army is falling back. I would say that it was this decision to evacuate and to reset up the industrial base in the east that actually allowed the Soviet Union to maintain defense production throughout the war and to supply the Red Army. So if we take it back a little bit, and we consider the fact that the vast majority of German divisions were concentrated on the Eastern Front, that's where the war was being fought, that's where it was waged, and to a large extent, that's where it was won. This decision to evacuate industry to be able to supply the Red Army, we can see as sort of the feat that won the war.
Donald, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would go on to your the next question that you send us on your list, because I think that's more relevant.
All right, then I'll pose it for those of you who didn't get the list. When in reading Fortress Dark and Stern, you then take us into evacuation, into these regions far enough away from the Germans so that they could, in fact, Wendy, set things up. But if the Soviets actually evacuated between 15 to 25 million people, which in itself is not comprehensible, let's talk about what happened to them when they actually got there. First, tell me about where they went and what the conditions were like. And as I said here, I'm assuming that these lands did not look anything like the lush forested hills of Western Ukraine.
No, they didn't. And this is where people begin to start to encounter enormous problems. Because you have the transformation of whole cities into industrial centers. cities like Kirov, which were small towns, become major industrial areas. Kuibyshev, which is modern day Samara, becomes the center of the aircraft industry. You have the massive infusion of people, literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of new people coming into the Urals, to Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk, and these cities are totally unprepared for this influx. We have to differentiate between different categories of people, because you've got the people who were sort of evacuated as part of the organized plan that Wendy's described, and they tended to go with their factories. They often got separated and had to make their own way to separated along the way and had to make their own way to their final destination. But they were the so-called organized contingent, and they went with their factories. But there were also millions of people who went spontaneously, who fled. They were refugees, basically. And they, through absolutely some amazing adventures, had to make their way through all kinds of means using different kinds of transport. People were on boats that were bombed. They then had to, they were saved and then had to find another way to go. They were separated from their families. In some cases, many cases, they were able to reunite with their families in their distant locale. So that's a whole nother side of the story. But in any case, the conditions that they encountered were extremely difficult because there was no housing for them. These were cities that their populations increased by, 10, 30, 40, 50% in a matter of months. And you have to appreciate that urban infrastructure in the Soviet Union was very rudimentary. So these were cities that had almost no sanitation. They had very little means to house these people, so they quickly put up wooden frame barracks of the most basic sort. And a lot of people for quite a long time lived in what were known as dugouts. They were literally earthen houses made of turf that stuck out of the ground with a stovepipe coming out of the roof. And they might house one family, they might house many, many people, these dugouts. Really conditions were very, 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 very difficult for people. The amazing thing, though, is that basically the factories arrived. A lot of bits were missing. They got lost along the way, but they were able to put stuff together and put production units together, and people were able to go to work. Should also mention that a lot of people who weren't going to be gainfully employed in the war effort tended to be sent to rural areas, to collective farms. Some of them found jobs because a lot of them had sort of a certain degree of education, so they could work as accountants on the farms, etc. But there was a lot of resentment because refugees, they wanted to eat, but they really weren't used to, a lot of them weren't used to doing physical labor. And they, in many cases, could become quite a burden on the collective farms in a situation where food was extremely scarce.
Well, why don't we go to the next question that I'd come up with, which is, so you've got 15 to 25 million people that've gone out to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and then in Central Asia and all of these places. How did they feed that many people? And obviously we know that they didn't. In many cases, people lived quite badly from what they could do. But could you both address something about the agriculture and how they were able to ration food and get food and grow food? And what did they grow?
So Ed, I can turn to food in just a minute, but I just wanted to say a couple of things about your question to Don about what happened in terms of the consequences of this decision to move the industrial base. One of the things that we haven't really talked about at all is that it's not just the evacuated population that ended up in the East, but also there was a committee that was set up to mobilize everybody who was not working. There was a compulsory military draft, and millions of people were also sent east under that military draft. So the problems that Don talked about of housing people and feeding them and caring for them in cities and towns and empty spaces where there was no infrastructure at all. It wasn't just evacuees and refugees. It was also millions of people who were mobilized to work far from home. So one of the things that's interesting to think about is the impact on the family, because families were often split up in all kinds of ways as people were mobilized for labor. And also, we often think of the home front as something that's stationary, while the military front is something that moves. But in the Soviet Union, in World War II, the home front too was a front that was genuinely moving. And, you know, there's one thing we wrote in the book that nobody woke up in the same bed on Victory Day on May 9th, 1945, that they were in on June 22nd, 1941. So we have massive population movement here. And the state really had to take on the care of these people. The trains that had the equipment, the factory machinery, were often unloaded in the middle of winter on empty steppe land amid howling winds and snow. People stepped off those trains. They often had no place in which to live, and literally structures rose. They were being built around the machinery after workers had already started producing. So that's just, I think, quite an amazing image of structures rising up around machinery as people are producing for the front. And the second thing that I think is really interesting is that factories were crammed into every possible existing building, and they were often forced to share space with each other. So we have situations where you have an ammunition factory sharing space with a paper factory. The ammunition, as you know, is extremely combustible. One spark can just set everything off in an explosion. With a paper factory. We have chemical factories, we have telegrams. You must separate these two, sharing space with a meat factory. I mean, so the emissions, also the hazards that workers were being exposed to were huge. Every kind of occupational health and safety rule basically is thrown out the window, because you now have, in very crammed spaces, doubled, tripled, combined emissions of things that these chemicals and offshoots have never been, combined before. So I think that there were enormous, let's just say, implications for evacuation. And one of them, as you note, of course, is food. How were all of these people going to be fed? Don, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, the rationing system is the main thing that, let's start with the fact that they had very few resources to work with. So they've got to organize the population. And they developed a system with increasingly fine gradations. So the first priority is, of course, industrial workers. And within that, you have the first priority of workers in the key areas that they need to have producing, which is defense and defense-related industries. Then below that, you've got a lower criteria of workers in so-called non-essential essential enterprises. Then you've got clerical staff, clerical workers, and then you have dependents, who are the lowest on the totem pole. So there's two things about the rationing system that are very important. One is that it attempted to make sure that everyone got some food, and in an organized fashion. And the main source of nutrition was bread. Bread provided the overwhelming proportion of calories and nutrition in the diet. And the people on bread, the number of people on bread rations was far higher than the number of people on rations for other foodstuffs, such as meat products or fish products or small amounts of dairy products that were available. The other thing to keep in mind is that the ration on its own was inadequate from a nutritional standpoint to keep people alive. So people had to find other sources of food. And one of the remarkable aspects of the situation here is that what they call decentralized supply. In other words, every unit, the factories, hospitals, schools, had to find some way of providing at least part of their own food supply for their constituents, for the people who work there, over the school students, school children, or hospital staff, etc. And and this applied to almost everything. So they had to go out in the wood to get into the forest to get their own firewood, because that was the main source of fuel. They had to get plots of land and try to grow food to supplement the very sparse rations that were that they could get a hold of. Distribution was, as you can imagine, not always the most efficient, because a lot of institutions, including factories, were allocated rations, but they didn't actually receive them. Basically the system, at one level, the system worked extremely well. In other words, you had ration cards, people got their cards, and they could get a basic entitlement. But as Wendy, I think, will describe, there were huge leakages in the system. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of finagling. You've also got, you have to keep in mind that rationing in and of itself did not guarantee you food. You had to pay for the food. The ration entitled you to the right to buy the food. So if you were a very low-paid young worker, and a lot of young workers were very low-paid, a lot of them had to, they couldn't afford to buy the meals in factory canteens, as sparse as these meals were. So they actually sold their bread cards on the open bazaar on the market in order to get the money to go back and buy food in the factory. So it was a very complicated system. And I think Wendy will say more about the leakages, and then possibly later I can say something about the impact that all this had on people's health.
Well, maybe we'll move into the aspect of health, because what I learned from the book, and I did not know, maybe others did, is that malnutrition very often leads to tuberculosis. Who knew? But now that leads into the question of how did they tend with health matters, with bad sanitation and terrible conditions, and then all of the malnutrition that had to just be devastating to the society.
It was devastating, and this again is a very multifaceted story. First of all, you have to appreciate that the Soviet Union at the start of the war didn't have enough medical personnel. The doctors that they had tended to be concentrated in the west of the country, in Moscow and in Leningrad and in Kiev, and to a certain extent in the larger cities in the hinterland, like Sverdlovsk, where they had a large medical schools and research hospitals. The rural population was very poorly served. There were hardly any doctors in the rural areas. They depended on paramedics and midwives and nurses. So this is already starting. Then you've got the fact that you have an occupation of Ukraine and Belarus. So they didn't lose all the doctors, but a lot of doctors are called up into the military. So the number of doctors available for civilian care is much diminished. It's somewhat augmented by the evacuation of doctors too old to go into the army from Ukraine. So that's somewhat compensated for that. So the level of healthcare to begin with isn't very solid. Then you've got the fact that at the beginning of the war, largely thanks to evacuation, you've got epidemics breaking out along the routes of evacuation. You've got a typhus epidemic, which is spread by lice, and lice jump from one person to another when they're in close contact with each other, and you can't bathe or change your clothing. And you had a measles epidemic, which decimated which killed large numbers of small children. Also, food supplies and sanitation were very poor on the evacuation trains, the so-called echeloni. And a lot of babies and young children died of gastrointestinal infections, or they starved. This is particularly a problem for the children who were evacuated a little later on from Leningrad, who were already in very poor health. The death rate amongst them was very high. This is a very tragic situation. But the amazing thing is that, and then these people are settling in these towns where literally the sanitary situation is almost indescribable. They have to deal with piles and piles of human waste. What are they going to do with it? They try burying it, but burying the waste is in competition with the need to use every spare square meter of land to grow food. And these are real health hazards. And the way they deal with it is they introduce much needed sanitary reforms during the war. You've got an outfit called the State Sanitary Inspectorate. These were sanitary physicians who were absolutely, in terms of pay and prestige, at the very bottom of the pile before the war. They take the initiative, and their status rises quite significantly because of the sanitary catastrophe. And they go around inspecting things, and they try to do the best they can to organize cleanups to get the waste removed out of harm's way, out of the cities. They organize mass campaigns, which become a permanent feature during the late Stalin period, to clean cities up. They also they engage in a very labor-intensive but very effective means of epidemic prevention and epidemic control. That is, anyone who's suspected of having lice or having a fever or a contagious disease, you try to identify them, you isolate them, you identify their contacts, you disinfect where they were living, the dormitories where they were living, or if they lived in an apartment, you disinfect that. These are very basic epidemiological tools, which in fact, it's interesting, modern governments, including where I live in Britain especially, totally ignored during the outbreak of the COVID-19 epidemic, much to everyone's cost. So I'll stop there for the time being. That's a general picture of how they tried to deal with the situation.
Wendy, do you have something to add on this, or should I go into the?
Just something to add a little bit about starvation, and which I think is something that's very, very important. So, we had talked about how the ration could not cover biological requirements, and there were other sources of food, but basically by about 1942, malnutrition was quite widespread. And by 43, we're looking at starvation-related deaths, even in the defense factories. So that's where the highest level of ration was for defense workers. What's, I think, interesting that came out of all of this is we also know that Leningrad was surrounded by the German army. Hitler had made the decision to let the city starve to death, and about close to 1 million people within the city, which was besieged for over 900 days, did in fact starve to death. While this was happening, doctors in the Soviet Union, doctors in Leningrad, doctors in the East, and also, interestingly, doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, where people were also starving to death, were beginning to understand new things about starvation. It had been thought that starvation was just an absence of food, and that if you just refeed people quickly, you can bring them back. But in fact, what the Soviet doctors began to discover, along with the Jewish doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, who themselves were starving to death, was that starvation is actually a disease, and it has stages, and they stage the disease. There's a point at which the body consumes fat, and then there's a point at which the body consumes its muscle, and then there's a point, and this is the point where things are irrecoverable, where the body actually begins to consume its own organs, like the heart and other things. So they also pioneered forms of refeeding people. And I would say that by 1944 in the Soviet Union, the situation with food got much better. And a lot of workers then were put on special refeeding programs. Children were put on refeeding programs. And those programs took advantage of every possible scientific understanding at that point, which was more advanced than it had ever been, but still quite rudimentary, about how to bring people back from these advanced states of starvation disease.
Um, uh, that is fascinating. The Jewish aspect of all this is obviously interesting to someone running a Jewish Historical Institute. And because of the brutal, violent, and murderous way that the Wehrmacht and the SA were to everyone, it's fair to say, however, that every Jew that they were going to find was going to be ghettoized, taken out to a ravine and shot, or in a forest, or worked to death, or in some cases taken to concentration camps. You quote the historian Itzhak Arad in your book, who estimates that through the evacuation, Jews being involved with their factories or laboratories and research centers, that around 1.6 million Jews were saved. But how many Jews do we figure were murdered during from June 1941 until the Soviet army came and took the land back to sometime in 44?
The figures that I've seen are that about 2.6 million Jews were murdered on Soviet soil by the Nazis. And that was out of a total population of about 5.1 million. So a lot of the Holocaust, which is something we don't know very much about in the West, did take place, by the Germans on Soviet soil. And I think this is something that there's more and more research on now. It's not the subject of Don and my book, but it is, I think, a really important subject that's being opened up more and more. And you have some wonderful stuff in the archive, Ed, that relates to this.
So, Don, do you have anything to add on that?
No, it's not my field.
Then let's go to the fascinating subject of by 1943, the Soviet army had regrouped, reorganized, and had turned the tide on the Germans. And as they took territory back, they found horrific damage. I think you mentioned that, if I remember this correctly, that over 9,000 towns and villages in Belarus alone were burnt to the ground. And if the Germans had occupied so many towns and cities from 1941 through 43, and in some cases 44, that means they had to have cooperation from local authorities to carry out what they needed carried out. So the question is, how did the quest for justice interact with the kinds of what I would consider Soviet paranoia that we've all read about over the years? There must have been some horrific hearings and tribunals and trials. Do we know how many people were actually charged with collaboration? How many were jailed and how many were executed?
The figures are spotty. But let me just talk about it in a sort of a more general sense, rather than sort of getting into the statistics. So when the Red Army came back, the liberated territories had pretty much been completely destroyed. I mean, everywhere there were pits filled with Jews and non-Jews, pits filled with human beings, gallows in the town squares with murdered, tortured bodies. They discovered it was a wasteland, a devastated land that they discovered. And in order to rebuild this, they needed functioning organizations. So what they did was they relied on the Soviets and the Communist Party. The party organizations in the newly liberated territories were completely decimated. As you know, in addition to Jews being a target of the Nazis in Operation Barbarossa, the kill orders also went out for all party members, all members of Soviets, anybody that had been involved in Soviet administration. So these people were murdered as well. For the party members who, for whatever reason, had remained on occupied territory, when the Germans came in, they were forced to register with the Gestapo. There was one of these, orders that went out. Jews register, party members had to register. So everybody who was in the party when the Red Army came back and was discovered to be on occupied territory had to go through a very complicated verification system. There was a sort of rough line of justice here. Anyone who was discovered to have named names to the Gestapo, in other words, to have betrayed other party members or handed in a list or done something of that nature, was subject to prosecution. And about 40% of party members who had remained in the occupied territories were excluded from the party in the verification process that occurred after those areas were liberated. The bar, however, for remaining in the party was pretty high. You had to have shown not only that you didn't collaborate, that was obvious, but you also had to show that you had actively aided in the struggle against the occupiers, either that you had been involved with the partisan movement or that you had been involved in some kind of underground work. In addition to verification of party members, the unions, which also became an organization that were very active in terms of reconstruction, also verified workers before they would be allowed re-entry into the union. So workers also went through a process of verification. And then finally, the entire population of the occupied territories, people who had remained, had to re-register with Soviet authorities in order to get rations, because the ration system was now extended into the newly liberated territories, and they also had to register for work. So registration committees were formed of young people, Komsomol members who had been in evacuation, to filter out those people in the local population who had collaborated, or Red Army soldiers who had deserted, or people who had no papers and were just wandering around, or people who had false identifications. And these commissions worked sort of full time to re-register the population. The basic approach was, if you had worked for the Germans in some menial capacity, as a laundress or as a cleaner or as a janitor or in some form of forced labor, those people were not prosecuted. The people who were prosecuted were those who had informed on others, or people who had participated in German administration or German punitive organs, people who had aided in arrests, who had aided in roundups, particularly of the Jewish population, people who had aided in mass killings. All of these people were then subject to trial and arrest. And small military tribunals were established throughout the liberated territories to judge collaborators. There were trials, there were witnesses, and there was a whole process going on whereby neighbors were coming forward to discuss what they knew about people who had collaborated. The very first public trial of war crimes that actually predates Nuremberg by about 2 years takes place in July of 1943, in which 11 men in Krasnodar who had worked for the SS Sonderkommando, which was a subunit that was involved in the mass murder of Jews and other civilians. These 11 men were tried, and it was discovered that a number of them had operated mobile gas vans, which were the sort of German prelude to the gas chambers, where they were experimenting with killing people by gas in gas vans. And 8 of these 11 were actually sentenced to death by hanging. It's a public trial. It's on YouTube. You can see it. And it's very interesting to see the reactions also of the local population. Ed, you're muted.
Unmute.
You've got to unmute.
I can't.
There we go.
There, sorry. Okay. Right. So Donald, do you have anything to add to that, or should we go into the next point, or maybe you can segue into the next point, which is in Western Ukraine, especially, I imagine that this was a special case since more than a few Ukrainians had never wanted to be in the Soviet Union in the first place. And millions of Ukrainians, of course, were starved to death during the Holodomor in 1932. So I imagine there must have been quite active collaboration with some Ukrainians and the Germans when they were there, if I have that right.
I think Wendy knows more about this than I do, but I think you have to differentiate between Western Ukraine, which was not originally part of the Soviet Union, and Eastern Ukraine. And the particular grievances that people had grievances were rather different. Also about Western Ukraine, which used to be Galicia, of course, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anti-Semitism was really quite deeply seated in the culture there, and I think a lot of that carries over here. I think that the story that needs stressing here, I think Wendy knows more about it than I do, is the story of the Ukrainian nationalists, who were both anti-German and anti-Soviet and anti-Jewish and anti-Polish. I think it's probably not too much of an overstatement to say basically these were anti-Nazi fascists, and they committed horrendous atrocities against Jews, against Poles, against Roma, etc. I think it's easy also to overplay the extent of collaboration in Ukraine, especially in Eastern Ukraine, which was a largely industrialized area with a large ethnically Russian as opposed to just Ukrainian population. These people also suffered enormously. I've seen some interesting documents, not in part of our research, but in collections of documents, that also the rural population in these areas, they thought that the Germans were going to disband the collective farms, give them freedom. And of course, the Germans didn't disband the collective farms. They reimposed the collective farms, and they persecuted the local population. So a lot of potential pro-German sentiment at the time of in the initial phase of the occupation, I think very rapidly disappeared.
Right. Wendy, do you have anything to add to that before? Michal, what's our time slot here?
We can go until, I would say, till 2. I mean, you can finish your questions. It's okay. We have time. I would say.
Well, maybe I will jump to this next thing so we can open up for questions, because as I've mentioned before, toward the end of the book on page 370, and of course, log roll for the book, we really, all of us hope that you'll order the book, Fortress Dark and Stern. And you summarize so well, because there's a photograph that we look at on this page. It's of a T-34 tank, and it's surrounded by soldiers. It's not a staged photograph. It is on the way to battle, I suppose. And then what you do is you analyze that photograph. and you tell us about the weapons that these soldiers are holding, about the tank. You tell us about their helmets. You talk about their blankets and their clothes, because each of these things was actually manufactured thousands of kilometers to the east. And that made that interesting in itself. And then you remind us that aside from the forging of steel and the sewing of uniforms and the manufacturing of all these weapons came from raw material that actually came even farther from the east, where the resources were mined, the sheep were shorn, and the cotton grown, all of which went into the efforts by the Soviet Union to arm its soldiers and then take back their country, and then eventually fight their way to victory. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Well, I've actually always used that as a sort of teaching device. I teach a course, the Soviet Union in World War II. And often I've drawn the soldier on the board. But in this case, of course, we found this phenomenal photograph. What we wanted to do with the photo, I think, was to do precisely what you pulled out of it, Ed, which was to link the military front with the workers on the home front who supplied them. And also to show, in a way, the limits of total war. So for every soldier and the armaments that he or she relied on at the front, and you just made this really clear in your question, there was a long line of people reaching back thousands of miles who had made these things. And behind the defense workers, of course, there were others who mined the coal or cut the peat, cut the lumber, poured the steel that was necessary to fashion those objects. And behind this vast body of people that were laboring in the forests and the bogs and the mines, there were the peasants who fed them. So one of the things that you see when you study Soviet social history in this period is that by 1943, just about every resource was being devoted for production for the front. The collective farms were short of peasants to sow and to reap. They were sending university professors and high school teachers in the spring onto the collective farms to help. And I don't think that they were actually, at least in the peasants' estimation, very effective at it. But they were terrifically short of labor. The factories were all short of labor, despite compulsory labor draft. They had literally run out of people to mobilize for work. The provinces were thousands of people short on their mobilization targets month after month after month. And the entire country was weakening from the systematic lack of food and all consumer goods. People were dressed in rags. They had no shoes. They couldn't get to work. It was a frequent reason. Can't get to work because can't go through the snow in bare feet. So total war had actually stretched the country to the breaking point. And the breaking point, you know, it's a metaphor, right? But for us, it became incredibly clear. What's the breaking point? It's the point at which defense workers are beginning to collapse from hunger. That's the breaking point right there. And so I think one of the main points of the book, and that's in part why we ended with that photograph, was to show the enormous cost to the people on the Soviet home front, to show the cost of this victory against fascism, which means so much to all of us.
Donald?
Well, I think it's a very useful exercise when you think about, because everyone, whether you were in a military industry or not, was part of the war effort. Those uniforms were made in the textile industry. The textile industry was militarized. It was subject to military, to the same labor laws about compulsory work, where was leaving your job was a criminal offense, etc. As the same as steel or weapons production or tank production. And these were women who were mobilized and very low paid, very hungry. They had, in the textile regions, they were looking after multiple dependents, many of whom were small children or were disabled, and juggling that with working 10, 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, no days off, no holidays, etc. And this is important. We have to remember that cotton came from Central Asia, from Uzbekistan, and that's a separate story. There was enormous hardship in these areas. There was hunger in these areas. And a lot of the farms were denuded when they mobilized hundreds of thousands of men to go work in industry and in construction. So really, this is something that affected basically, it extended its tentacles basically into every aspect of the society. And I think what Westerners can't quite grasp, they not only don't grasp that the Red Army basically was the key to winning the war, but they don't grasp the sheer, the extent of the hardship that the Soviet population endured in order to achieve this victory.
Right, I think we've pretty much come to the end of what we've wanted to do. The obvious final question that I would ask you to comment on was, at Centropa, we created an archive that was meant to be open source for everyone, and that means from high school students, and I see we have one of our favorite high school students from South Carolina here, and to university professors doing PhD research, which thrills us when you're able to use our archive. And the question is, how did the Centropa archive, was it able to be useful to you?
We found it to be a brilliant source. And I mean, one of the questions that Wendy and I discussed is, and on several occasions when corresponding about and producing the book, was because all the interviewees are Jewish, of course, and it raises the issue to what extent their experience is typical of the general Soviet experience, and to what extent it had its own peculiarities or specificities, let's say, because these people were Jewish. We discussed this yesterday, and I think we came to the consensus that, in fact, there were probably some things in their experience that were influenced by the fact that they were Jewish. But if you look at those interviews and you cross-reference them with other sources that we've got, memoirs, other interviews, and other people, oral histories that we've done, you find that their experience was generally universal experience. When they describe their work, when they describe the way their experiences as refugees, how they got to where they eventually wound up, the difficulties they encountered. These were things that were common experiences of everybody. But what was wonderful about the archive is the number of interviews that are available as an oral history project. It's massive. And we were only looking for stuff to do with the war. So I didn't even begin to search what material is available on other topics or other aspects of our Soviet and Eastern European history. We can't say enough about how wonderful this archive was for us.
Well,
I just want to say, Ed, that the archive is a wonderful, amazing achievement. What is in there is just astounding. And I would urge everybody to take a look at it. It is a goldmine. The interviews are so moving and so informative. You yourself had sent me that interview with Basia Chaika, who was one of the, she was 16 or 15 years old at the time that she was part of a tribunal judging collaborators in a newly liberated territory. She describes her experience with that. I mean, this stuff is priceless. So I cannot, the archive is so useful for so many things, not just the war, but for the post-war period, for the pre-war period, for understanding Jewish life in so many different contexts, for understanding the tragedy of Jewish life in this particular period. It is just, it's a stunning achievement.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. And what we really wanted to do was to get stories, and as many as possible. And we always hired people in each country who the first people they interviewed were their grandmothers. That was Basia Chaika's granddaughter who actually interviewed her, who's now actually doing who's a teacher, and we work with her in Ukraine. This, by the way, just to paint a picture for all of you, this is a girl who at the age of 16, and she talks in pictures where she said she'd walk into was it not in Krasnodar, it was in, I forgot the town, Konatet?
Yeah.
She walked into a social, a dance on a Saturday night, and the whole room separated to get away from her because she was going to hang somebody.
The hanging judge.
It's tough, but then Wendy and I have talked about, once you go into this, once you start reading a Centropa story, you go down the rabbit hole, and it's hard to come out of it. So I want to thank you both for going into our Centropa rabbit hole. But as someone, as I said at the beginning, who has really gobbled up all the histories of the military histories of the war, I'd never looked into what you have gone behind the curtains and shown us and gotten us to think about. We didn't even talk about the fascinating propaganda aspects, which is a whole chapter in the book, which we'd like to do. But I'll turn things over now back to Michal, and I think there's a question or two, so we'll leave it at that. And I want to thank you both very much.
Thank you so much, Ed and Wendy and Don. It's really fascinating. And I do see a question, and I also have some questions of my own. I'm going to start with a question from Mary Lindemann, and her question, she asked whether did you find the definition of home front problematic? How difficult was it to separate the home front from the war front? I'm thinking about how Grossman's book on Stalingrad each flowed almost seamlessly into the other, or could be distinguished one from the other.
Don, you want to?
Well, the home front and the military front are constantly in flux. Places that start off as the home front wind up as part of the military front. And then, of course, from 1942, 43 onwards, you get movements in the opposite direction. But I think, having said that, the distinctions really are quite clear. Behind the lines, where there's a degree of safety, that's where the society is being organized. In other words, where does the state have control? Where does the state, where is it able to exercise its influence and authority and its organizational powers in order to pursue the war effort? And I think if you look at it that way, then I think, as I said, there's certain borderlands that, especially when Ukraine is liberated, become part of the home front. But for most of the war period, we're really talking about a fairly well-defined geographical area.
I would just say that I think in a lot of ways, you look at a place like Stalingrad, what's home front, what's military front, you really can't separate them at all. And similarly, you know, one of the main slogans of the war was a single united military camp, meaning that both home front and military front were united as a military camp. So you have military discipline on the labor front. People who left their jobs without permission were tried as deserters. In other words, they are subject to military discipline. There was constant bombing of places that would be considered home front. and people were involved in all kinds of activities. Pensioners, for example, were involved as fire spotters. They would stay up all nights on the rooftops trying to spot and then put out the incendiary devices that fell on the apartment buildings. So you have people that normally, I guess, maybe in a different kind of situation would be somewhat protected from the war, now are subject to bombing. They're involved in drilling. There was the Opolchenia, or the Home Front Militia, which actually in a number of cases fought side by side with Red Army units to defend particular cities or towns. So I think Mary's right in certain ways. We do have this very powerful interpenetration, which is very interesting.
Thank you. We have another question from Zakun Liu, and was asking, I would like to know whether or not the relocated factories were all moved back to their original sites after the war. How much did the relocated factories and skilled workers contribute to the development of cities in Siberia?
Well, Don's done a lot of work on this.
It's the history of the history of evacuation and what happens to these factories is really quite interesting, because you might have a factory. Suppose you have a factory, say in Ukraine. That factory isn't necessarily all shipped on one train to one location. It's split up. So part of it might go somewhere, part of it might go somewhere else, part of it might go yet to another location. By the same token, receiving factories are receiving not just one evacuated factory, they're receiving bits and pieces of lots of others. So when the war ends, these factories don't go, some of the workers go back to where they were, but basically these evacuated factories, they become the new production units in the hinterland. And they function that way throughout the entire post-war history of the Soviet Union. And then some of the factories are notionally returned to their original sites, but of course the structures that they occupied, say in the Urals or in Central Russia, they remain. So they also become new additions to the productive base. What you also see is that the re-evacuation of people is not a smooth process. It's interesting to look at files for after the war, because you see a lot of complaints about people who are expecting to be re-evacuated back to their homes, and they're waiting for an awful long time. In some cases, a couple of years before they're allowed to go home, before they're allowed to go back. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got a lot of people already in 1944 spontaneously defying the prohibition on leaving your job and spontaneously re-evacuating themselves to where they used to live, where they used to work, and with the collusion of their former factories, they're given jobs, again, totally illegal, totally against the law, but they get away with it.
Thank you. I have a question for you. That in the book you talk about this distinction that's made between refugees and evacuees, and that was very interesting to me, because in a sense, all the people who are being evacuated, even though they're part of this concerted effort, are in a sense refugees to some extent. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that distinction and how do they keep track of who was a refugee and who is an evacuee among civilians in particular?
Well, they made a distinction, the clear distinction, with the so-called organized contingent and the unorganized contingent. The organized contingents were workers and their dependents with designated factories or production units that were or schools or vocational schools who were supposed to be moved out. And they were allocated, they were notionally, they didn't always receive them, notionally allocated certain resources, both for their travel and for when they got to where they were supposed to go. then you've got all these millions of people who pick up stakes and flee. And they're basically going as individuals or in small family units. And the state has a responsibility to them once they show up somewhere, because they have to place them in work and they have an obligation to work. But they're not necessarily provided for along the route or along the way. And some of the stories that you see about these people, their stories are quite remarkable, how they actually survived bombings. And as I said earlier, their boats getting torpedoed or rather bombed and their boats sinking, etc., getting separated from their families. But this was not an organized process. And these people are, as I say, there's millions of them. These people are wandering all over the country trying to find somewhere where that's safe and where they can earn a living, because, you know, if you don't work, you don't eat. You don't get a ration card.
So it sounds like the distinction was during the journey, but once the people arrived, those who came on their own, then they were provided for.
Well, the state had a responsibility. Go on, Wendy.
I was just going to say, I think there's a system, and then there's chaos outside of the system, which might be one way to think about it. So nobody was supposed to technically get up, leave work, pick up their family, go down to the train station, and take up a seat on a train to go wherever without permission. You were not supposed to leave unless you were told to leave. Leaving was technically organized by workplace or by category. So for example, large numbers of children were placed on trains to move out. But the problem was the front moved so fast and so much territory fell under German occupation so quickly up to the end of 1941 that people were unable, let's say, to get, they fled on their own. They either tried to get on a train, which was often very difficult, or often they just hit the road. They hitched a ride with a horse-drawn cart, or sometimes with military vehicles that were in retreat. We've got a lot of that. They just tried to get to safety. And so I would say this distinction that you've made, which is one also that the government made, completely breaks down when you're actually looking at what's happening amid the panic and the bombing and all the rest of it. Evacuation as organized is still taking place, right? But there were also, it's accompanied by just waves of refugees that are trying to get out. And then of course, when people arrived, they had nothing. So they had to go to register for a ration card. Then once again, they become part of a functioning system. But so you have people on the roads though, often for months, who don't have rations. They can't show up in any particular place. They're selling their clothing, jewelry, whatever, to the peasants to exchange for bread. So you've got a lot of that going on as well. It's organized plus chaos, might be a way to think about it.
I think there's a part of the book where I think we describe Stalingrad, not Stalingrad later on when it's under siege and when it's to the battle, but much earlier when Stalingrad was a safe haven. And I think we described the number of refugees there, the difficulties they had provisioning them. They were living out in the open air. There wasn't any sanitation. There wasn't enough food. And they sent some, I can't remember, some officials come in to try to create order out of this chaos, which they effectively do. And it's a microcosm of what's going on all over the country, really.
Thank you. I just want to end by, I know that both Wendy and Don mentioned a few times in the book as well, but also today, that how much the greater struggle against fascism means to them. And I'll mention before I come to something that I found quite moving in their book, that both of my maternal grandparents were in the Red Army. And it wasn't until I read this book that I realized that probably they were part of evacuation. They fled Vilna right after the invasion, 1941, on June 22nd. And my grandmother was able to get to Minsk. And in reading your book, I realized how quickly that front was moving, which means that my grandmother probably she walked to Minsk, and from Minsk, she got on a bus to Moscow. And probably that might have been one of she obviously was moving very quickly, and she was part of the Kopsumol. So that also explains probably how she was able to do that, given that front, again, was moving so quickly. And my grandfather was a foot soldier, joined the Lithuanian division of the Red Army, and ended up in the Battle of Kursk. So he probably also was, given he was from Vilna, was part of evacuation. So I learned a lot about probably how my grandparents were able to flee. And then in their book, something I found moving is that the dedicated, I'm just going to try to hold this up. So I'll try to show this. These are two photos, but to all those who fought against fascism on the home front and the battlefield and the forests, camps, and ghettos, and to our fathers, Lawrence Goldman and David Filtzer, soldiers both. We dedicate this book and these many years of research to you. And there's a photo of Wendy's father, Lawrence Goldman, private first class, receiving the Purple Heart after his transport ship was kamikazed in the Pacific. Here we go. And on the bottom, David Filtzer, Army surgeon who treated ex-prisoners in the liberated Nazi concentration camp. Thank you again, Wendy and Donald and Ed for interviewing them about this really outstanding and fascinating book. And thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
And
very
thank you,
much.
Michal and Ed. Yeah.
Okay. All the best to everyone.